Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Vav, Daf 46 of Masechta Sukkah. It's a Gishmak Daf. What can I tell you? The Daf begins with a machlokas about do you make a bracha every time you pick up the lulav, every day? What about the Sukkah? So we start off with a discussion about that, and then on Memvav Amud Beis, we will discuss the esrig. At what point, is it, after you're done using the esrig on the seventh day, are you allowed to already eat it? Or do you have to wait till after Sukkot? So that machlokas as well. We're going to start in Daf Mem Amud Beis. Amr Yehuda Amr Shmuel. It's 4 lines before the page gets wide. So Amr Yehuda Amr Shmuel. Lulav Shiva v'Sukkah Yom Echad. So says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that you make a bracha on the lulav every day. So every day of Sukkot, when you pick up the lulav, you're going to make the bracha of Asher Kidshanu B'Mitzvos V'Tzvanu on Atilas Lulav. And the Sukkah, however, you make a bracha of Leishav v'Sukkah on the first day of Sukkot, but that's it. That's it. My time, how come? Well, lulav demafsike leilis miyomim choyom mitzvah ba'apinavshu. Well, when it comes to lulav, as we had said a few days ago, that lulav is a mitzvah only during the day, not at night. So therefore there's like a hefsek, there's like a division between each mitzvah of the lulav. It's every day with a break in between for the night. So every time you pick it up every day, so you make a new bracha on it. Whereas Sukkah de lo mafske leilis miyomim kulu shiva kechad yom arichadamu, whereas Sukkah, it's a mitzvah during the day and during the night, continuously, from the beginning of Sukkot until the end. So therefore it's like one long day, one long mitzvah essentially, and you make a bracha at the beginning of it, and it continues throughout, and you don't make a new bracha each time you go into the Sukkah. Rabbi Bar Bachana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and says Rabbi Bar Bachana the name of Rabbi Yochanan the opposite, which is Sukkah Shiva Velulav Yom Echad. That Sukkah you make a bracha of Leishav Basukkah every single day, or I guess every single time you go into the Sukkah, I think. Whereas Lulav you only make one bracha at the beginning of Sukkot, and that's that. My timer. How come Rabbi Bar Bachana says this? Sukkah de Oraisa Shiva. Well, since Sukkah is mid Oraisa for all 7 days of Sukkot, so you make a bracha throughout. Whereas Lulav de Rabbanon Sagade B'chad Yoma. Whereas Lulav on day 1 is a mitzvah de Oraisa, but after that, at least outside of the Beis HaMikdash, or now, certainly nowadays, we only take definitely nowadays, right? Meaning during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, it would be midoraisa all 7 days in the Beis HaMikdash. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it was only midoraisa the first day. Mistama didn't take it anymore after that. Nowadays, however, because of the takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, so we take the lulav on days 2 through 7, zeicher l'mikdash, to remember the mikdash, midorabbana. Midoraisa on the first day, we take the lulav midoraisa. So we make a bracha on the first day, but the rest of Sukkot, it's only midrabanan. So we're not going to make a bracha on that. As opposed to Sukkah is all 7 days, it's midoraisa, so therefore we're going to make multiple brachas. Okay. When Ravin came, he said the name of Rabbi Yochanan that both the lulav and the Sukkah, we make a bracha for all 7 days, and at least that's what I do, at least, right? Every day when you take the lulav, you make a bracha on the lulav, and every time you go into the sukkah, if you eat a meal, so you're going to make the bracha of leishev basukkah. Rav Yosef nikod Rav Bar Bachana b'yodoch. So Rav Yosef says that you should go with Rabbi Bar Bachana's explanation of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that you make a bracha on the sukkah for all 7 days, and on the lulav only on the first day. Because when it comes to Sukkah, all of the Amoraim agree with Rabbi Bar Bachana's opinions regarding Rabbi Yochanan, right? Meaning, We have Ravan quoting Rabbi Yochanan, we have Rabbi Berakhot quoting Rabbi Yochanan, we have a bunch of people that could be quoting Rabbi Yochanan in general, right? There's a lot of Amoraim who quote Rabbi Yochanan. So Rav Yosef says, look, in general, all the Amoraim agree with Rabbi Berakhot's explanations of Rabbi Yochanan when it comes to Sukkah, and therefore, says Rav Yosef, we should hold like Rabbi Berakhot, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that you make a bracha on the Sukkah for all 7 days of Sukkot, whereas you make a bracha on the Lulav only on the first day of Sukkot. Meisvei. We have a kasha on Rabbi Berakhot in the name of Rabbi Yochanan / Rav Yosef, who says that the halacha is like him. Ha'usa lulav la'atzmo. A fellow makes a lulav for himself. Okay, but he takes the hadasim, aravis, lulav, makes a hoshaina, an erev sukkos. Omer baruch shechianu v'kimanu v'gyanu l'zman hazeh. So when he's done constructing his hoshaina, he makes a bracha of shechianu, an erev sukkos. Nitalu latzizbo, and then the next day, on the first day of Sukkot, he takes his lulav to biyotze, the mitzvah of lulav. Omer baruch asher kedushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu al netilas lulav. He then makes the bracha of al netilas lulav on the first day of Sukkot. V'afal bisha berach olav yom rishon chozer mevarich kol shiva. Ho ho. And even though he made a bracha on the lulav on the first day of Sukkot, he continues to make a bracha on the lulav for all 7 days of Sukkot. How it says sukkah la'atzmo, a fellow makes a sukkah for himself. Omer baruch shechianu v'kimanu chulei. So he makes a bracha of shechianu when he finishes constructing the sukkah. Nichnas leishev ba, and then on Yom Tif he goes into his sukkah to sit in his sukkah. Omer asher kedushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu leishev b'sukkah. So he makes the bracha of leishev b'sukkah. And once he makes a bracha on the first day of Sukkot, that's it. Kasha lulav alulav, kasha sukkah sukkah. Says the Gemara, we have a kasha on Rabbi Berakhot's interpretation or explanation of Rabbi Yochanan. We have two kashas. We have a kasha regarding the lulav. Rabbi Berakhot says you only make a bracha on the lulav the first day and that's it. Whereas this brisa says you make a bracha on the lulav every day. And also, Rabbi Berakhot said that the sukkah, you make a bracha on the sukkah every day. And this brisa says that you only make a bracha on the sukkah on the first day. So mamish, the opposite of Rabbi Berakhot. And for the Gemara, Bishlomo lulav alulav lokasha. The Gemara says, look, I can explain to you what's going on with lulav. How come Rabbi Berakhot can say that you make a bracha on the lulav only on day 1, whereas the brisa says all 7 days? Kan bizman shebeis hamikdash kaim, kan bizman she'ein beis hamikdash kaim. Well, when there was a Beis HaMikdash, and you were in the Beis HaMikdash, and lulav was a mitzvah d'oraisa, all 7 days, so you would make a bracha on the lulav on each of the 7 days. Now that there is no Beis HaMikdash, and we take the lulav all 7 days, zecher l'mikdash, to remember the Beis HaMikdash, but it's midar abonon, so says Rabbi Berakhot, or we explain for Rabbi Berakhot at least, but he also, this is his opinion, that nowadays, we would only make a bracha on the lulav on the first day, and the rest of the days, you would not, because it's only midrabban. Sukkah kasha, but what about the sukkah thing? What about the fact that Rabbi Berakhot says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that sukkah you make a bracha all 7 days, because it's midoraisa, and yet in this brisa we're saying that you only make a bracha on the sukkah on the first day. Friends, what do? Tanoihi. So the Gemara answers, it's a machlokas tanoim. It's just a machlokas tanoim. The Tanya is we learn in a brisa, tefillin, kolzman shemanichan v'varich aleim tivei Rebbe. Rebbe says when it comes to tefillin, every time you put them on and take them off and then put them back on, each time you put them back on, you're going to make a separate bracha. Whereas the chachamim say that you'd only make a bracha in the when you put them on the first time you put them on in the morning. So we see that when it comes to tefillin, Rebbe's opinion is that even though it's all one long day, right? You're going to be putting on tefillin throughout the day. Rebbe's opinion is, as you take them off and put them back on, even 100 times, you're going to make a separate bracha each time you put the tefillin back on, even though it's all one long day. And therefore, in the context of Sukkah, so we said that Sukkah, there's a mitzvah during the day and at night, which means that it's a continuous mitzvah from the beginning of Sukkot until the end. The mitzvah doesn't stop, day, night, throughout the entire festival. And we'll say that, well, just like Rebbe says that by tefillin, each time you put the tefillin back on, you make a bracha. So also when it comes to Sukkah, each time you go into the Sukkah, you would make another bracha of Leishev Basukkah. And therefore Rabbi Bar Chana, who says that you make a bracha on the Sukkah every day of Sukkot, so he would hold like Rebbe, that you make a bracha on the tefillin every time you put on the tefillin. Whereas the rabbis say, the Chacham say, whereas the rabbis say, you only make a bracha on the tefillin in the morning, when you put them on the first time in the morning, and that's it for the entire day. So that would be like Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, that you would only make a bracha on the Sukkah at the beginning of Sukkot, and then since it just continues straight throughout Sukkot, you would not make another bracha on the Sukkah. Itmar, it was stated, Abaye says that the halacha is like Rebbe, that you'd make a bracha on the tefillin every time you put them on. Rava Amar Hilchsak Rabbanon, Rava says that the halacha is like the Rabbanon, that you would only make a bracha on the tefillin once, in the first time you put them on, and that's it. Amar Rav Mari brought the Shmuel, says Rav Mari, the daughter of Shmuel, right? We've learned about this before, that Shmuel had a daughter who was taken captive, and she conceived Rav Mari while there, and therefore he kind of went after her name as opposed to his father's name. Chazina le Rava delo abed kishmaite. It says Rav Mari brother of Shmuel that we've actually seen that Rava doesn't do like he held, right? Meaning Rava says that the halacha is like the Chachamim, that you make a bracha on the tefillin once in the morning and that's it for the entire day. And yet, says Rav Mari brother of Shmuel, I've witnessed Rava make multiple brachas on the tefillin. He would wake up in the morning and he would go to the bathroom, wash up, and he would leave the bathroom, wash his hands, and he would put on his tefillin and make a bracha. And if he had to go to the bathroom again, he would go to the bathroom, he would go out, wash his hands, and he would put on his tefillin and make a bracha a second time. So we see that even Rava, who says that the halacha is like the Chacham in practice, meaning he says that the halacha is like the Chacham, that you'd only make a bracha on the tefillin when you put them on for the first time in the morning, in practice, Rava himself, each time he would put the tefillin back on, he would make a new bracha. Vanonami, and we also, ki Rebbe Avdinan, hold like Rebbe, umuvarchin kol shiva. And we make a bracha on the Sukkah, all 7 days of Sukkot, even though it's one long, uninterrupted mitzvah because it's day and night, nonetheless, we're going to make a bracha on the Sukkah throughout. And it's like Rebbe, who says that you'll make a bracha on tefillin each time you put them on. Omer Marzutra says, Marzutra Chazina later Rav Papi, says Marzutra that he saw Rav Papi duchol emas de monach tefillin mevarich. Every time he would put on his tefillin, he would make a bracha, even if it was multiple times throughout the day. Rabbanan Dvei Rav Ashi, the rabbis by the Besmedrash of Rav Ashi call emas de mishamshei b'mevarich. Every time they would touch the tefillin, they would make a bracha, right? And Rashi points out that we learned in the Gemara in Eruvin, in Yoma, that you should be touching your tefillin while you're wearing them to remind yourself that you're wearing tefillin. So the rabbis by the Besmedrash of Rav Ashi, every time they would touch the tefillin to remind themselves that they're wearing tefillin, they would also make a bracha. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, mitzvahs lulav kol shiva. Okay, that the mitzvah of lulav, that you make a bracha on the lulav all 7 days, like we saw earlier. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar, whereas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Yom Rishon mitzvahs lulav, that on the first day of Sukkot, the mitzvah of lulav is midoraisa, and therefore you make a bracha on the lulav on the first day of Sukkot, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. However, mikan ve'elach mitzvahs zikenim, however, after day 1, from days 2 through 7, lulav is only a mitzvah derabanan, zecher lamikdash, and therefore, says Rabbi Shua ben Levi, you would not make a bracha on a mitzvah derabanan. Rabbi Yitzchak says, kol yom a mitzvah zikenim. Rabbi Yitzchak says, actually all 7 days are a mitzvah derabanan, and therefore you would not make a bracha. Mistamim? Yeah. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, where am I? I just read that. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar kol yom a mitzvah zikenim. Va'afilu yom rishon. Even the first day of Sukkot is midrabanan. V'alkaim alon yom rishon d'oraisa. But I thought we said that the first day of Sukkot, l'kachtam lechem b'yom rishon. Of course it's midoraisa. Ema bar miyom rishon, say except for the first day. All of the days of Sukkot, lulav is midrabanan except for the first day. Yachi anu Rabbi Shua ben Levi. If that's the case, then he's saying the same thing as Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that the first day of Sukkot, lulav is midoraisa. The rest of the days, it's midrabanan. Ema v'chein amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Say, yeah, exactly. And similarly says Rabbi Yitzchak that the mitzvah of lulav is midoraisa, like Rabbi Shua ben Levi, is midoraisa on the first day, and you make a bracha. The rest of the days, lulav is midorabanan, right? The first day, lulav is midoraisa, you make a bracha. The rest of the days of Sukkot, lulav is midorabanan, and you do not make a bracha, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, who agrees with Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rav Sover kol shiva mitzvahs lulav, and Rav also holds that you make a bracha on the lulav for all 7 days. That even though on days 2 through 7 the mitzvah of lulav is only midrabanan, nonetheless we make brachas on mitzvahs derabanan according to Rav. So he essentially agrees with Shmuel that you would make a bracha on the lulav all 7 days. The Amar Reb Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav Hamadlik ner shel Chanukah. Says Reb Chia bar Ashi in the name of Rav that somebody who lights Chanukah menorah, which of course is midrabanan, right? That only happened in the second temple. Tzarich levarich, you make a bracha on it. So we see that Rav says that you make a bracha on mitzvahs derabanan. Rav Yirmiyah Amar, says Rav Yirmiyah, haru ner shel Chanukah tzarich levarich, that somebody who even merely sees Chanukah candles makes a bracha on it, right? Meaning if he hasn't yet lit Chanukah candles and he sees Chanukah candles, he can make a bracha on seeing them. My mevarich, what are the brachas that he makes? Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, Yom Rishon, on the first day of Chanukah, Hamadlik mevarich shalosh aram mevarich shtayim, a fellow who's lighting candles makes 3 brachas, a fellow who's looking at candles would make 2 brachas. Mikan ve'elach, from day 2 and onwards, Madlik mevarich shtayim v'aram mevarich achas, a fellow who's lighting Chanukah candles would make 2 brachas. A fellow who is looking at Chanukah candles would make 1 bracha. Umay mevarich, what's the bracha that he makes? Baruch Asher Kedshanu b'mitzvos v'tzvonu l'adlik ner Chanukah. The bracha that you make when you light the Chanukah candles is lehadlik ner Chanukah, to light the Chanukah candles. Ve'echon tzivanu, where were we commanded? Who commanded us to light Chanukah candles? It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah. Milo tasur. It does say in the Torah that lo tasur, do not stray, lo sasur min hadavar she'agidu l'cha yom v'shmol, don't stray right or left from that which the rabbis say to you. And therefore, all mitzvahs derabanan we have to listen to, and we're commanded to do them from the fact that the Torah says don't stray from what the rabbis said. And therefore, Chanukah, lighting Chanukah candles, it's midrabanan, but we could still make a bracha of Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omar shalavicha v'yageitcha. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, it comes from the pasuk of ask your fathers and they will tell you. So the rabbis also, they're telling you what to do, and therefore you can make a bracha on it. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak masni la behedra. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mentions it explicitly. Amar Rav kol shiva mitzvahs lulav, that it's not just implicit from the fact that Rav says that by Chanukah candles you can make a bracha on it. So memele also by lulav on days 2 through 7, which is midrabanan, Rav would say that you could make a bracha on that as well. But says of Nachman bar Yitzchak that actually Rav says it explicitly, kol shiva mitzvahs lulav, that you make a bracha on the lulav all 7 days of, but they make a bracha on the lulav all 7 days of Sukkot, like basically like Shmuel says as well. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught us a sukkah la'atzmo, a fellow makes a sukkah for himself. So he makes the bracha of Shecheyanu. Nichnas leishev ba, and then on the first day of Yom Tif, when he goes in to sit in his sukkah, Omer Baruch Asher Kedishanu v'chulei, so then he says, leishev basukkah. Haisa asuya v'omedes, if the sukkah was already made, okay, we learned about sukkah yeshana earlier in the Masechta. Okay, we say if the sukkah was already made and he didn't actually, so meaning we said a second ago, when he finishes, and also earlier in the daf, we said that when he finishes constructing his sukkah, so then, even before sukkah starts, an Erev sukkah, whatever it is, he says, Shechianu. And then on sukkah, when he goes to use his sukkah, he says, Leishev basukkah. But it says, the Braise, that I saw Asuya v'omedes, if the sukkah was already made, or let's say maybe even he hired somebody to make his sukkah. How about that? He hired somebody to make his sukkah, so he didn't himself construct the sukkah. So if he could add something to the sukkah, so then you can make a bracha of shechianu. Im lav, if not, well then so no problem. On Yom Tif, when he goes to sit in the sukkah and have his Yom Tif Suda in the sukkah, so then he'll also chaparain and say shechianu. Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi chazina le Rav Kahana dika Amar lihu lechulu akas de kedusha. Says Rav Ashi that Rav Kahana would just save everything for Kiddush on the first night of Sukkot, and when he made Kiddush, he would also say leishev basukkah and also shechianu, and that's what we do l'maaseh in my personal family tradition. Tana Rabbanan hayu lefan of mitzvahs harbe. If a fellow had a whole bunch of mitzvahs to do, such as sukkah and lulav, Omer Baruch Asher Kedishanu Mitzvos V'Tzvanu Ala Mitzvahs, just feed a bunch of birds with one seed, and you just say Asher Kedishanu Mitzvos Ala Mitzvahs. You don't need to make a separate bracha on the lulav, a separate bracha on the sukkah. Just say, I'm making a bracha on the mitzvahs. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda Mevarich Al Kol Achas V'Achas B'Fnei Atzma, whereas Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that you should make a bracha on each of the mitzvahs separately. So make a bracha on the lulav, a bracha on the sukkah. Amar Reb Zera v'Item Rab Chanina Bar Papa Ilchus Rabbi Yehuda. Says Rabbi Zera, some Taka says Reb Chanina Bar Papa, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that you make a bracha on each and every mitzvah separately. Amar Reb Zera v'Item Rab Chanina Bar Papa, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. Says Reb Zera, some say to Reb Chanina Bar Papa, what's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda who says that you make a bracha on each and every mitzvah separately? That the pasuk says, blessed is God each and every day. What do you mean, blessed is God every day? What about at night? What it's saying to you is, every day, give him brachas in the context of the day. Meaning, if it's Yom Tif, mention Yom Tif in the bracha, right? You should bless him for Yom Tif. If it's Shabbos, mention Shabbos, right? Brachas should be contextualized. Okay? Where are we? So now apply it also to mitzvahs. That each and every mitzvah, you should make a bracha in the context of that mitzvah. And therefore, don't just lump everything together and say, Asher Kedishanu Mitzvos Ala Mitzvahs. Rather say, Al Natilas Lulav, Leishev Basukah. Give each and every one its own space and its own proper attention. And bracha. He says, come friends, and see that the ways of God are not like the ways of man. That generally speaking, in the world we live in, an empty vessel is able to receive, a full vessel can no longer receive anymore, it's filled up. However, it's a beautiful word, no? That when it comes to human beings, when it comes to physics, when it comes to the way of the world, you have a bucket. If the bucket's empty, you could fill it up. Once the bucket's filled up, you can't put anything more in there, it's filled up. However, when it comes to the Eibishter, when it comes to Torah, when it comes to the human mind, it's the opposite. That specifically, a Yid who's learned a lot of Torah, he could learn even more Torah. The more you learn, the more you can learn. But if a fellow doesn't study any Torah, and it's empty, his knowledge is empty, it's going to be very difficult to learn anything. That if you filled yourself up, you could fill yourself up even more. But if you've remained empty, it's going to be very, very difficult to get anything in there. Wow. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Vayim shamoa tishma v'gomer. If you heard, you will listen. Im shamoa tishma v'im lav lo tishma. If you listen, well then you will listen more. But if you don't listen, you don't learn. So you're not going to learn anything. It's going to be very difficult to learn. Where am I? Davar acher. Im shamoa biyashon tishma b'chadash. Another way of understanding is that if you go back and you do chazar, you review the old things, you review what you already learned, you'll find even new layers of depth to what you already learned. Whereas, but if you just learn something once and you never get back to it, so then you're never gonna, it's just gonna kind of fall away and it's gonna get lost. Wow. So the Mishnah had continued and said that then on the 7th day of Sukkot, after they're done with using the Hoshaina, so then the adults would take the esrogim from the kids and eat it. Rabbi Yochanan says that an esrig on the 7th day of Sukkot is osir. Is also the entire day, even after you're yotzei the mitzvah on the 7th day, you don't need to be yotzei the mitzvah with it anymore. It's still asur for the entire 7th day, says Rabbi Yochanan. On the 8th day already, it's going to be on Shmini Atzeres. Okay, so the esrog is mutter, you don't need it anymore. Sukkah afilu b'shmini asura. The sukkah, interestingly, says Rabbi Yochanan, even on day 8 remains muksa, remains asur. You have to wait till after Shmini Atzeres. Even if you want to use like the schach for firewood or something like that, you have to wait till after Shmini Atzeres. And the Gemara is going to ask, wait, why is esrog considered done after 7 and yet Sukkah extends to day 8? The Gemara is going to ask. Sukkah, where am I? Rish Lakish Amar says, Rish Lakish, esrog afilu b'shvi nami mutter. Whereas Rish Lakish says, no, actually the esrog, even on day 7, is permitted. Kilu, once you were yotzei the mitzvah of the esrog on day 7 of Sukkot, and now you're already yotzei the mitzvah, you don't need it anymore. So you can eat it already on day 7. But my kamiflige, what's the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish all about? My sarva the mitzvah is katzoi. Well, Rish Lakish says, look, the esrog was set aside for the mitzvah of daled minim. Once you were yotzei the mitzvah of daled minim for the final time on day 7, you don't need it anymore, and you can eat it therefore. Well, my sarva the kula yoma is katzoi. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you're not specifically just setting aside the esrog for the daled minim, you're setting it aside for all of Sukkot. And as long as Sukkot is going on, so then it's going to remain, unusable. Also, you're not going to be able to eat it. So you're going to have to wait until day 8. Then on day 8, you can eat it according to Rabbi Yochanan. Eisvei Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish asks a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, miyad tinokis shomtenes lulvein, our Mishnah had said that on day 7, after they were done using the daled minim for the final time, the adults would take the esrogim from the kids. My love, who had in the gedolim. And it says Rish Lakish, someone doesn't have to be kids, it can even be, adults. And therefore, it says Rish Lakish, from the fact that sort of after they used the daled minim for the final time on day 7, we see that they were already eating the esrogim. That means that once you have completed the mitzvah of esrog for the final time, you can eat it immediately. Lo. The Gemara says no. Tinok is davka. No, it's davka the kids. Specifically, the kids would be allowed, right, they could eat the esrogim from the kids, but adults, right, Rabbi Yochanan would say, no, adults would have to wait until day 8 because the esrog was set aside for the entire Sukkot. Those who say they was talking the opposite, that it was Rabbi Yochanan who asked Akasha and Rish Lakish that miyad tinokis shomtenes lulvein v'ochlin esrogein, that the Mishnah specifically says that they would chap the esrogim from the kids. Tinokis in gedolim lo. That davka they would chap the esrogim from the kids, but they would not be allowed to chap the esrogim from the adults because it's set aside for all 7 days for the entire Sukkot. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you see, the esrog is set aside for the entire sukkah. It's not just until the mitzvah is done. So huadin dafilu gidolim. So Rish Lakish would respond and say, no, the Mishnah is not limited to kids. Even the adults would be able to eat their esrogim by the Ktani Tinokis. And the reason why we mentioned kids specifically is Orcha de Milsa Katane, because it's more common, right? Meaning an adult, it's probably more common to just go up to a kid and chop his esrog, right? There's no saying like stealing candy from a baby. Much easier than stealing candy from an adult. So they would just go to find a kid, chop his esrog, and eat it. It's more difficult to do that with an adult. And as Rashi pointed out in the Mishnah, don't worry, don't be concerned. It was all out of jubilation. Fine. So okay, fine. So Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that the esrog is set aside for all 7 days of Sukkot, whereas Rish Lakish says that the esrog is set aside for the mitzvah, but once the mitzvah is done, then you can eat it. Now Rav Papa asked Abai, Rabbi Yochanan ma'ishna sukkah, ma'ishna esrog. So Rav Papa asked Abai, says, I don't understand. According to Rabbi Yochanan, so he says that, okay, the esrog is set aside for all 7 days. Then on day 8, you can eat it already. Shouldn't it be the same thing for Sukkah? That Sukkah, right, Sukkah is, right, there's no mitzvah of Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So therefore, shouldn't we say that come Shmini Atzeres, Sukkah, is mutter, you can do whatever you want with the schach? So, Amr le Sukkah dechazel levein hashmoshes, the Isrami le Sudasa, ba'emesav begava, umecho begava, it's katsoy levein hashmoshes. Let's read that again. So Abaye answers Sukkah, that when it comes to Sukkah, dechazel levein hashmoshes, that it's fit for the bein hashmoshes between day 7 and day 8, right? What's bein hashmoshes? Of course, it's once the sun sets on the 7th day of Sukkot, and between the time that the sun sets and the stars come out, and Tzeis HaKochavim, it's what's called bein hashmoshes, between the suns, that it's Safek Yom, Safek Laila. We're not sure if it's considered day, in which case it would be day 7, or if it's considered night, which would be day 8. The Yisrael Sudasa by Mesa Begava, Umecha Begava. And if a fellow needs to eat during bein hashmoshes on the 7th day of Sukkot, he would eat in the Sukkah. So it's Katzor Levein hashmoshes, which therefore means that the Sukkah is still considered set aside for bein hashmoshes of day 7. So when you set aside the Sukkah for Sukkot, it's including bein hashmoshes on day 7. Umigo des Katzor Levein hashmoshes, and since the Sukkah was set aside for bein hashmoshes of day 7, it's Katzor Lechula Yoma Deshmini. It's also set aside for the entire 8th day, right? Because bein hashmoshes is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. We're not sure if it's considered day or night. And if it's considered day, then it's part of the 7th day. But if it's considered night, then it's already considered part of the 8th day. And therefore, since it's a Safek, we're unsure, right? Since we set aside the Sukkah to include the bein hashmoshes of day 7, which is potentially the night time of day 8, which is therefore day 8, we have to be stringent and say that the Sukkah is muktzah, including day 8 as well. Esrig, but in Esrig on the other hand, the lo chazi levein hashmoshes, which is not for bein hashmoshes, once already you did the mitzvah of Esrig on day 7, that's it. There's nothing to do with it, bein hashmoshes. So lo is katzoy levein hashmoshes, so therefore it's not set aside for bein hashmoshes, it's just, you set it aside for day 7, but that's about it. There's no need for it during bein hashmoshes on day 7. So v'lo is katzoy l'chulei yoma deshmini, and therefore, since it is not set aside for bein hashmoshes of day 7, it is also not set aside for day 8, and you can already eat your esrog on day 8. However, the Sukkah, since you could potentially still use the Sukkah during bein hashmoshes of day 7, so therefore it's still muktzah for the entire 8th day. You'd have to wait until after Shmini Atzeres to use the Sukkah according to Reb Yochanan. Okay, very nice. The Levi Omar says, Levi esrog afilu bashmini aser. Now Levi says that actually the esrig is even asr on day 8. Okay? V'avur de Shmuel amar esrig b'ashvi asr b'shmini mutter. Whereas Avur de Shmuel says, like Rabbi Yochanan, that the esrig is asr for the entire 7th day, but on day 8 it's already mutter. Come Avur de Shmuel b'shitzei de Levi. In the end, Avur de Shmuel came around to hold like Reb Levi's opinion, which is that the esrig is even asr on day 8, because since Ben Hashmashos, as we said a minute ago, is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, we're not sure if it's day or night, and the esrig is set aside for the entire 7th day, and therefore, says Reb Levi, so that 7th day would extend into even the Ben Hashmashos, because maybe that also might be part of the day. So therefore, it's set aside even for Ben Hashmashos, and once it's set aside for Ben Hashmashos, it's set aside for the entire 8th day as well. So we said in the end, Avur de Shmuel turned around to hold like Levi. Come Reb Zera b'shitzei de Avur de Shmuel. And Reb Zera ended up holding like Avur de Shmuel that the esrig is set aside for 7 days, but not the 8th day, which is essentially also Reb Yochanan's shita. Then Reb Zera says, Reb Zera esrig shenifsila also lo'ochla kol shiva. That Reb Zera says that if an esrig becomes pasul, you're nonetheless forbidden from eating it for all 7 days. You have to wait until day 8, but on day 8 you can eat it, like Avur de Shmuel said, like Reb Yochanan said. Reb Zera says, Reb Zera lo liknei inish o shaina linoka b'yom hatava kama. Says Reb Zera, a fellow should not essentially transfer ownership of his lulav to a child on the first day of Sukkot before he himself has been yotzei the mitzvah of lulav. My time outcome diinoka miknokani aknuyu lo makni. The reason being that a child is able to accept ownership of something, but is unable to transfer ownership of something. And therefore, Reb Zera is saying, on the first day of Sukkot, where it says, that the Oshaina, that the Dal Minim needs to be yours on the first day of Sukkot. If you transfer ownership of your lulav to a child before being yotzei the mitzvah yourself, so the child will now gain ownership of this lulav, but will be incapable of transferring the ownership back to you. And therefore, if you end up using that lulav, which you had already transferred to the ownership of the child, you're going to be using a lulav that doesn't belong to you, that rather belongs to the child. So therefore, says Reb Zera, make sure that if you're going to transfer ownership of a lulav to a child on the first day, make sure you're already yotzei the mitzvah of lulav, because otherwise you're going to be in trouble. V'amar Reb Zera, and says Reb Zera, lo leima inish li nuka. A fellow should not say to a child, an adult should not make promises to a child, should not promise to a child that he's going to give the child something and then fail to deliver on that promise. Because you're going to end up teaching this child that it's okay to lie, and then the child's going to end up lying. So says Reb Zera, you shouldn't lie to a child. You shouldn't make false promises to a child. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, limdu l'shonu d'var sheker, and that you will be teaching their tongues to speak lies. And this machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about, is the esrig permissible to eat after you used it on day 7, or is it still forbidden until day 8? And we said it's a machlokas about, did you set it aside only in the context of the mitzvah, but after you're done with the mitzvah it's mutter, or did you set it aside for the entire sukkahs? So that's a machlokas. It's like the following machlokas. The Idmar is stated here for Shiva Esrogim, the Shiva Tziyomim. What if you set aside 7 esrogim and you'll use a different esrig each day of Sukkot? So says Rav, okay, amazing, gewaldig. So you have 7 esrogim. So each day after you use the esrig, you can then eat it. Whereas Ravasi says, you use each day you'll use a different esrig, and then the next day you can eat it. What are they arguing about? The machlokas is that Rav says, look, the esrig is set aside for the mitzvah, and once you yotzei the mitzvah, you can eat it. So says Rav, every day after you use that day's esrig, you can now eat it, which is like Rish Lakish is saying that the esrig is set aside for the mitzvah. Whereas Rav Asi says that every day you use that day's esrog, and then the next day you can eat it because the esrog is set aside for the entire day. Like Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the esrog, if you have one esrog, it's set aside for the entire 7 days of Sukkot. Cheve, we're going to stop over here. That was Daf Memvav of Masechta Sukkah. I think it was a very interesting daf. Right? The daf began with how many brachas do you make on a sukkah and on a lulav? Do you make a bracha on the lulav every day or maybe just the first day? And the same thing with the sukkah. We saw three opinions. The opinion of Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, who says that the lulav you make a bracha every single day because it's divided up, the night breaks it up, and therefore every day is a separate mitzvah, whereas the sukkah is one continual mitzvah. And therefore you only make one bracha at the beginning. And Rabbi Berakhot says the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it's actually the opposite. That lulav, which is only doraisa for one day, so you make one bracha on it the first day. Whereas sukkah, which is midoraisa for all 7 days, you would make brachas throughout. And then we saw the opinion of Ravin, which I think lemaisa is what we do. At least that's what I do. Is you make a bracha on the lulav every day as well as on the sukkah every day. Okay, fine. And then we discuss what exactly the brachas are, Shechiyanu, Anatilas Lulav, Leishiv Basukkah. In that context, we also discussed a little bit about the mitzvah, the brachas that you make on Hanukkah candles, because that's another example of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that we make a bracha on, just like Lulav nowadays is Zeichel Mikdash Midrabbanan, and we make a bracha on it. That's like the Hanukkah candles. We saw that you make a bracha when you light Hanukkah candles, but Yirmiyah says even when you see Hanukkah candles, you can make a bracha on it. You just wouldn't say lahadik nir shel Hanukkah. You would say just sha'asa nisim lavaseinu v'yom mehem b'zman hazeh. We saw an interesting agadita, which we've seen before, which is that while in the physical world only an empty vessel could receive, a full vessel cannot receive, but when it comes to studying Torah, davka, somebody who's learned more is able to receive more, whereas somebody who's running on empty, it's difficult to receive at all. And then we got into a machlokas about to what extent does the esrig remain sort of set aside for daled minim on Sukkot. Rish Lakish says, look, on the 7th day, once you've used your esrog for the last time, you don't need it for the mitzvah anymore, so you can eat it. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you didn't just set it aside for the mitzvah, you set it aside for the entire day, for the entire Sukkot, and therefore you can only eat it on day 8. That was similar to a machlokas that we saw at the end between Rav and Rav Asi, that if you set aside a separate esrog for each day of Sukkot, so Rav says, look, after you use that day's esrog, you can eat it. Rav Asi says, no, you can only eat it the next day because it's set aside for the entire day. And then we said, according to Rabbi Yochanan, what's the difference between esrog that we say on day 8 you can eat the esrog, whereas sukkah we say that you can only sort of get benefit from the schach of the sukkah after Shmini Atzeres. We say, well, sukkah, theoretically, if you wanted to eat in the sukkah during Bein Hashmashis on the last day of Sukkot, if you wanted to eat during the Bein Hashmashis and the last day of Sukkot, you'd have to eat in the sukkah. And therefore, since Bein Hashmashis is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, so you're basically, you're potentially setting aside the sukkah also for day 8. Because if you can eat in the sukkah during Bein Hashmashis, which is potentially night, and night is the beginning of the next day, so day 8 is you're setting aside the sukkah also for day 8. So therefore, you can't use the sukkah until after Sukkot, until after even Shmini Atzeres. As opposed to the esrog, once you're already yotzei the mitzvah of esrog on day 7 of Sukkot, well then you're done, and therefore it's not you're not going to end up using it during Bein Hashmashis on day 7, and therefore it's not set aside for Bein Hashmashis, and therefore it has nothing to do with that night / Ki'ilu, the 8th day of Sukkot, and therefore comes the 8th day, comes Shmini Atzeres, already you can eat the esrog. Chaver, that was Daf Memvav of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.